Warning. The following may contain concepts, ideas, and or reflections unique in nature and not yet approved by government and or corporate entities. This content is for entertainment purposes only and is not intended to stimulate further reflection or to perpetuate additional discourse beyond the scope already outlined by institutional curriculum. We live in a world where a mixture of genetics, experience, and learning help to form an eclectic mental mosaic built on a nearly infinite number of synaptic pathways. If the mind was a lock and communication was the key, it wouldn't be hyperbolic to say that over 1 trillion distinctive crests and valleys would be required to open it. What should amaze us is not that we can disagree, but rather that on a framework that is so complex and unique, we can still find any commonality at all. Incredibly, our sophisticated thought factories don't stop there, for there is an innate desire to share our dendric revelations with another corporeal being of a similar composition. To do such begins with an expulsive air, tracheally and larynxically manipulated into a form suitably discernible for the other person's auditory receptors to decipher. If the receiver's own synaptic infrastructure fires back in the affirmative, then we may say that a communication has occurred. In the realm of communication, there are 3 main possibilities. Firstly, the synaptic patterns of the communicative entities have linked up so closely as to require very little in the way of clarification and or amendment. This can result in either a definitive ending of agreement, or it could inspire a further exchange of related thoughts. We will call this to be in a state of agreement. Good for a little endorphin rush, but if you're sitting on top of a mountain of information ready to unload with both barrels, you may be feeling a little unsatisfied with the rapid fire, "I totally agree." Secondly, the patterns in the dendric material line up close enough for recognition to occur, but the thoughts carry enough divergence to require clarification and or amendments. These variations usually result in a larger format dialogue with less certainty of outcome. Some individuals view this as an improved form of thought exchange, being more dynamic than the previous form and giving more opportunity to modify and ultimately improve upon one's own thoughts. On the other side of the spectrum, we have the intellectual emperors, who perceive any attempt to modify or amend their thoughts as a personal attack, and they will become hostile and combative. Bizarrely, their highest concentration in the demographics are the very top and the very bottom of society. The upper echelon population tend to take an offensive stance as they are more interested in manipulating the rest of the population's cognition than having their own question. In the lower echelon, taking on a more defensive stance in an attempt to preserve a degree of dignity that they're not used to. Unfortunately, these poor souls latch on to their wealthier counterparts in an attempt to raise the value of their own opinions. However, they normally only manage to secure a position in the vanguard of an elitist agenda, becoming nothing more than cannon fodder. Please note that these intellectual emperors were not mentioned in the first example, because if their thoughts are agreed upon uniformly, then they will typically react as any other individual. And finally, we come to where the cerebral fabric has little to no commonality. In the most extreme case, comprehension is never achieved, and further communication is rarely pursued. Conversely, when comprehension is present and a dichotomy of thought is realized, the participants are left with the following options. Either to refuse to engage in a superfluous argument, since neither party is likely to do a 180-degree turn on their beliefs after a single discussion, or to engage in total argumentative warfare, where all tools are wielded to maximum effect to eviscerate their opponent. This is when the intellectual emperors truly come into their own, and all manner of techniques may be employed, from strawmanning, ridiculing, and or censoring. The goal is to destroy the individual's character rather than defeating the individual's argument. And this method particularly profits the wealthy, who may utilize their means to maximal devastation. Some could say that the rich leveraging their power to silence the poor is reminiscent of authoritarianism, but we know the elite reducing the poor and middle class to ashes and dust is just good sport. Legend has it, there was once a group of individuals who could actually share a civil discourse with those whom they disagreed. They called this a discussion, where the two opposing sides would treat each other's ideas with mutual respect, and it was claimed that there could still be geniality between the two parties, even if neither yielded to the other's point of view. They analogously referred to this as iron sharpening iron, as though one could refine their respective thoughts by arguing with one who disagreed with them. Of course, this is only a myth, something a fact checker would tell his kids late on a Halloween night to frighten them. Growing up, science was one of my favorite subjects, and I seem to recall it was around grade 8 when we were taught about the scientific method. See if this sounds familiar. First, it begins with a question, and then with a combination of critical thinking and research, a plausible solution is formed. This is the hypothesis stage. The next is testing in a controlled environment. There are many rules in place here to help mitigate biases from tampering with the results. This is the theory stage. The final stage comes after the theory has been rigorously tested from multiple different sources, and if all the results come back with unanimous approval for said theory, it finally gets upgraded to the status of fact. Except that in my research, I found that the status of fact doesn't exist. Now, maybe I wasn't paying as close attention to my science class as I thought I was, but I was a little surprised when researching the subject how rare it is to actually see the word fact used at all, let alone being the actual epitome of what science is pursuing. But if this is the case, where did the word fact originally come from, and how is it properly used? Allow me to explain. The word fact comes from the Latin word facere, meaning to do or to make. This word also seems to have spawned the modern French word faire, with the same meaning. On a side note, with this etymology, the word factory makes a lot of sense as a place where things are made. This correlates to the definition in Webster's dictionary of a fact being something that has actual existence, an actual occurrence, or a piece of information presented as having objective reality, the quality of being actual, a thing done. Essentially, it hasn't strayed very far from the original Latin definition. Facts really came into their own in our legal system, where they became a critical part of the litigation infrastructure. The facts of the case were essential in proving a cause of action. In most instances, the facts would be almost synonymous with the evidence, but it's important to note that the facts alone would not be sufficient for a final judgment. Rather, they would be used to build a foundation for the case being tried. Try to imagine a judicial system that was based on the premise of, above all else, trying to uncover the truth of a legal action. Okay, maybe really try to imagine such a court. Alright, forget everything you know about judges and lawyers. Imagine an alternate universe where the primary focus of the law was the pursuit of justice and truth. Now that your imaginative mind is running at maximum capacity, we can continue to explain the facts in law. In this fantastical land, the facts would lay out the vector points as a reference for either a judge or jury, and then the lawyers would draw lines of reason between these points, forming a picture of the whole truth. However, much like the constellations, the pictures that could be drawn between vectors do require a good imagination. This is why both the defense and litigation lawyers will use the same facts, but they will paint very different pictures of the truth. And the judge or jury will need to use their critical thinking to determine the most plausible answer. And spoiler alert, even in a proper functioning judicial system, this is not infallible. Just in case you're on the fence about the role of facts, let's come up with an example. So the moving party submits a CCTV video as evidence, which shows the defendant pulling out a gun and shooting the victim point blank. Now, the defense is likely not thrilled with this evidence, but they would rarely contest its legitimacy, which means that the fact is the victim was shot by the defendant. However, this doesn't mean the trial is over. Actually, this would generally be submitted early on, and likely the defense already knew this evidence would be used pre-trial. And yet, we still don't have the complete truth. Even though this is about as strong a form of fact you will get to see, we still need a larger picture. What was the motivation here? Did the victim die from the gunshot wound? Was there a history between the two men? Was that little blurry patch around the victim's hand really a knife? Was this actually self-defense? Perhaps it's impossible to separate the truth from our biases, perspectives, and motivations. Surely there is an absolute truth, but the chance that we get to fully embrace it is remote. So if the complete truth is always just out of our reach, whether by a couple inches or a couple football fields, what is the solution? Certainly not allowing a free and open discussion amongst our peers. No. If only we could assemble a team of corporate, military, and political leaders to gather in Switzerland and determine what would be an acceptable or unacceptable dialogue for the plebeians to participate in. Truly, this is the best of all possible worlds. Freedom of speech and freedom of expression are constitutional rights in the United States. And yet many American corporations have dodged the issue, saying that as a private corporation, they can do as they please. Which is bold, since what they're saying is tantamount to, we are above the law. Interestingly, some have defended this stance as a right to refuse service, but I suppose it comes down to a matter of whether free speech is deemed to be essential or not. To which I will respond, free speech is not essential in a dictatorship, but a democracy without free speech is a fraud. But where do we draw the line on free speech? Surely people can't be allowed to say whatever they want. And to this, I would say, this is not a tree falls in the forest proverb. You can censor the mouth, but you can't censor the mind. If people say it, it's because they think it. Let's look at 3 examples of censorship. The first example is when a person has a view or claim that runs contrary to the government, the wealthy, the corporations, or all of the above. If the views were untrue, then they would be innocuous and easily dismantled by the mainstream media. Off the top of my head, maybe flat earthers would be a good example. But if there was even an element of truth in the view or claim, it would be deemed as too disruptive and censored to mitigate any damage it might incur to the parties of interest. If this one is true, democracy is dead, and we are left with a fate worse than feudalism, since we don't even know the faces of our overlords. I don't want to be overdramatic, so let's just call this one less than ideal. In the second example, the person has legal evidence against the elites. Fortunately, we don't have to worry about censorship here, since this person is already dead. These people tend to be extremely reckless drivers and enjoy a good suicide before submitting their evidence. The last example is reserved for the vulgar, obscene, or hateful. This is a strange group because sometimes they are used by the elite, and other times they are demonized. They don't really represent a group that I adore above all others, but I will still vouch for their right to freedom of expression. I've heard many people say that this is where they draw the line on freedom of speech, when people are bigoted, bullying, or violent. The violent one I really don't understand, so they would prefer to silence the violent people online so they can perpetrate violence quietly? No one likes to have vitriol spewed their way, but it is indicative of a deeper problem. And if we continue to sweep it under the rug, the problem will continue to grow and grow and grow until you can no longer feel safe walking the streets of any metropolitan area in North America. I guess I should wrap up this video. Can we separate the facts from the individual giving them? Is there such thing as a completely subjective and unbiased issuer of facts? In short, no. If an individual sees the value of sharing a fact, it is because the person has an opinion, a perspective, or motivation in doing so. Thus, before analyzing the facts presented, it is more prudent for us to judge the source. We must first respect the person before respecting what they have to say. This, of course, is easier said than done, and the less information we have on an individual, the more difficult it will be to divine the quality of their character. Still, it is important to remember that every original thought came from a person with their own unique experiences, feelings, and beliefs. Objective facts are a myth, one that the evil wish to perpetuate, since their warped natures would leave much doubt as to the merit of their statements. Conversely, if a person's words and actions show themselves to be bearers of a good heart, then there is merit in weighing their words, even if we would normally disagree. The liars and thieves have poisoned the well of civil discourse by being more interested in winning an argument to meet their own ends than those who present ideas for the common ultimate goal, the truth.
Smarts, don't it? You get all disorientated. The blood rushing to your brain. Your ears are on fire. But for what I got, that's as good as it's gonna get. And it ain't gonna get that good again.